business. I know Mike got my back. Skrilla on the track. Convention not. What that means is unconventional. Been in the game of you, so comprehend what I'ma give to you. Cause in the instant you can turn your hustle to an institute. I can't stop, I'm on top because I'm convention not. It's for the people like school teachers who think out the closet for causes that do reach us. And spark young engineers who interfere with what society's instilled in here. You keep me grounded, dog, and hold me down like my yogis that's hitting down with dog. Then it's back to business when I'm with my counterparts. No sitting down, so we walking around. Real talk, they talk about us, we the talk of the town. It's our chance, we contrast, but I ask that you pay attention while you listen to this podcast. I'm working with all I got, so when you see me, you know what I'm about.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Thanks so much for tuning in. On today's episode of Convention On, Ryan and I sit down and chat with Will Branch of Corridor Sausage. If you're in the Midwest and lucky enough to have a good grocery store around you, you know Corridor Sausage. I'll be honest, though, Will's journey is a little bit more unique than most. Not unlike many of our guests, some years after college, where Will went to school for journalism, he found himself with a degree and a position that he didn't really think was sustainable, ultimately forcing himself to make some really tough decisions. That fork in the road, so to speak, came one fateful night when he had a pretty serious conversation with a former employer. Let's just say that Will went left or right, whichever is the less traveled version in your mind. I gotta say, it was so good to get to know Will. He was so open and sharing with the pitfalls and the struggles that most entrepreneurs go through, much less being in the culinary sphere. Challenges abound. I gotta say, my only problem by the end of this interview is that I still hadn't figured out how to get some corridor sausage out here in Hawaii. Could be worse. For those of you who can get corridor sausage, get it. In the meantime, get to know the guy behind it, Will Branch.
Beard Bros. One of our very first podcasts was called it had a beards in the title. Like the first season that we ever did.
Beard Care or something.
Yeah. And these series of like 15-minute shows that we recorded on just USB microphones, right? Mm-hmm. Like we started messing with it. And one of them was like entirely about beards. These like little segments of things. Yeah. I think we've probably moved a little bit further from that. I guess maybe to that ado, we could introduce the other voice on the line. We've moved since that first season into, I think you're definitely in the 60s of episodes of interviews, Will. Mm-hmm. Today with us, we have Will Branch, who has a pretty cool career. And, in like convention not style, I'm not going to really pretext your career. Or rather, you just introduce yourself so people know who's talking on the other end.
Sure. So I'm Will Branch. I am the owner and founder of a company called Corridor Sausage. We started 11 years ago at this point. And I was at a point in my life after graduating from Michigan State with a degree in English and journalism that it was, crossroads of, well, what do I do with this thing? Like I was owed far more money as a freelance journalist than I had ever made. Mm-hmm. And it was time to either say, well, I'm going to go to law school or I'm going to go to culinary school is my other choice. And I ended up going to culinary school. And my goal was always to work towards something I loved, but also to own what I did at the end of the day. So we sort of incubated a company from that and that premise, and we were able to grow it to distribution across the Midwest and down the Eastern Seaboard. And this past year, we were able to merge in with a much larger company, which is where I find myself today. So not at all where I would have expected 11 years ago, but it's a good spot.
I can imagine that, merger is this weird world. And it's also a word that means different things to different people. Does that change your day-to-day dynamic from making the sausage, literally? Sorry for the pun. I had to get it out there.
It's one of the joys of owning the sausage company is all the puns and the jokes that go in.
Entendres, just endless, dude. Just endless.
But yeah, to answer your question, I mean, when we first started, it was myself and my partner, Zach Klein, in a little butcher shop that would let us come in for 3 or 4 hours on Tuesday and 4 hours on Wednesday and just work. And we had to get really quick, and we would sell at farmers markets and to friends. But that's how we started, was that level of hands-on with things. And even when we opened our factory in Detroit and we were operating under federal inspection for the first time, it was me and him and a couple employees that were all family members.
Sure.
So really for the first few years, it was just us making the sausage. And it was an on-running joke for a while that every time I'd leave to go on a 2 or 3 day sales trip, basically our stuffer would break or some electric would blow out or a water main would burst. And pretty much without fail, that's how it happened. So to be able to go from that to now a structure where it doesn't have to be me worrying at 3 a.m. every night how I'm going to keep the lights on, or what's going to happen the next day with pork production, where I'm in a structure and a paycheck shows up and I get to actually work with a really creative and passionate team too around me. So there was a lot of things that I think over the last few years I felt stagnant in, and really had emotionally started to try to move in other directions. And now I find myself kind of reinvigorated in a lot of ways.
That makes good sense.
Dude, can I just paraphrase real quick for our audience, bro? You know, that was all very well said, very articulate. I just want people to appreciate that we're talking to Corridor Sausage right now. Like this guy, he's talking about a couple years ago, he's putting in hours at a butcher shop. Well, now his products at Kroger, now his products like throughout the Midwest. Like, I gotta admit, I stopped drinking coffee a couple hours ago, but then I had another because I'm so excited just to like get into it with you, Will, because he was about to go down a road to be a lawyer, and now he's making sausage, and like he's made it. So I want everyone to sit back with that in mind and appreciate that. Like, I don't know how long you've been dreaming this dream, but it's so exciting to be able to talk to you when you're like at this stage of it. You mentioned that merger. Can I ask what were you in existence prior to your current? You know what I mean? Like, you have a name where you sell into the public? Like, what was it available in Detroit before you were this recent merger?
Correct. So a lot of our company is always focused on wholesale. And so we had accounts like Kroger with good local chains like Plum, like Bush's. Yep. And we sold that way. And most of our product really is wholesale facing. So there's a lot of restaurants and bars. Gotcha. We have a stand at Ford Field for the Lions game. We have a stand at Metro Detroit Airport by the Delta Terminal, which hopefully, will reopen at some point in 2021. Yeah. So we had a lot of those avenues we went through. And the merger, which was, really a conversation that began in late January, is one of the things that probably kept me sane through this last year. Because if we hadn't laid some of that groundwork, where I would be right now would be very different otherwise.
Sure. That's fair. Yeah, I mean, you're a little bit more, I don't mean to minimize it, but maybe a little bit more independently functioning before, right? But you were functioning as, it's always been Corridor Sausage?
Correct. So it was always just us and myself and my partner, and the stresses that come with that, right? So
everything.
Say like, how are we going to pay payroll, or when am I going to pay myself next, or just to be able to make next week's production, who do I have to pay to do this? Because it's still, at the end of the day, it's manufacturing. And there is a difference between, my passion is in creating food. It's in creating delicious food that is nutritional, and serves a need. And I like doing it with unique flavors, right? Like, so some of our better sellers are Vietnamese chicken sausage, Moroccan lamb sausage. And that comes just from, like, we like to play with our food and be creative. But then the bigger you grow and the more demands you have to meet, it's still based on machinery and equipment and real estate and staffing. And it's all of these things that it's like, okay, we're all romantic about the notion of the little guy with the butcher shop. Yeah. But then the actual reality of, well, where do you find employees to show up at 6 a.m. who want to work in a 40-degree environment? And it's very challenging. And I love that we've made it through it, but there's been a lot of unforeseen things. And, there's been a lot of not just sleepless nights, but a lot of life questions that have sort of arisen around it.
I know that we're going to move here, as we always do, into probably like how you started to learn to operate those machines and all those kinds of things. But before we do that, and I want to be respectful to what you're working on and the secrecy of that, but like, is the goal to expand Corridor Sausage into greater markets? Is it to, continue with like the franchise type, the over-counter type service? Like, could you talk a little bit about that, about what you guys are working on now from where you are?
Yeah, so a lot of it is with our new partnership is still the goal of growing the brand. Like, this isn't a company that was interested in buying us just to have a label. It was someone that really wanted our buy-in and really wanted to be able to retain myself and not just put me in a role with that company, but also to then grow Corridor Sausage. So I'm still extraordinarily hands-on with it, even as we're working on product development and some new lines right now with things that were dream projects for me. That when I envisioned Corridor Sausage 11 years ago, I was like, well, I really would like to do, X, Y, and Z, but I don't have the facility or the money to be able to do this. Now with some of the partners we have, we can do these things. We can leverage better networks and better infrastructure than we could have had. So that's one of the things I really find myself re-energized about.
Yeah, you went from, I'm sorry, but like somewhat you created a monster and then you're losing sleep trying to feed it. And now you've got a bunch of other people that are showing up to feed the monster, and you get to put new decorations on them and, a new outfit and like get back to how you built this monster. It was your creativity and diligence and knowledge, and like, unfortunately we build these companies and we spend all our time doing administrative work, and it's just like, I wonder why it hasn't progressed in 10 years. I've been doing bookkeeping,
reading their P&L and really understanding their balance sheet at a more deep level. But that's what we have, right? There's just a point where we have to know these things and we have to take ourselves away from the things we're passionate about to do it. And it's the reality of owning a business.
Yeah. Shit. And we could talk about this one. I'm probably the least educated on this subject. I know Ryan and you, like, we could talk about that subject forever. Like where you draw that line,
I think that's a good. Oh, go ahead, Will. Sorry.
I was just going to say that in sort of the last 10 years, some of the most therapeutic experiences have been bonding with other entrepreneurs and people. It doesn't matter if they're in food or retail or tech. It's been realizing when we all sit down at the table and just start talking, we all want to complain about the same things.
Sure.
All of us have the same growing pains. We have the same labor pains. And it's something that it's very hard to talk to a lot of people about. You feel open, you feel vulnerable. It's not easy to talk about like, oh my God, here's the debt we have. It's equal to a small island nation. Our new server, our new stuffer.
Right.
And I think I realized that, and I started working, in some growth classes and things like that, and some programs. It was just like, oh, it's everybody. It doesn't matter how big you are. It's everyone feels like this. Yeah. And then it makes you ask, why do any of us do it? Like that's still the question. Why would we do this to ourselves? And it's because, well, we don't feel comfortable sitting down at a 9 to 5, and we don't always feel comfortable reporting to someone else. And so you do it, and you deal with it until you can't.
I think the risk is to throw out that it's a cliche that's like, you do it until it kills you or like something like this. But I think that it's like, truly, it is this mix of curiosity and stubbornness.
A lot of stubbornness.
Yeah, man. Everyone we talk to.
Forth in between stubbornness and curiosity, then you're able to kind of build something. We get a chance to talk to a decent amount of entrepreneurs, even though this isn't a show about entrepreneurialism. I think it does happen that a lot of the people who are happiest in life are entrepreneurs. And you're right. I bet the debt to income ratio or whatever thing you might look for financial.
It's not what you think. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We could find that for sure.
Yeah. A house as an entrepreneur knows what we're talking about here of like, but don't you want our tax returns to not show too much? Oh, well, here's the problem.
Yeah.
So yeah,
you got to pay to play. You got to pay to play. Like, you know what? The people think entrepreneurship is about just not having a boss and working when you want to. And you know what? Those are, excuse my language, those are fucking perks. But guess what? No one else is going to do it. So it's got to get done. Like that, it boils down to, oh shit, I got no other source, and there's a lot of drama. I really associate with what you're saying about having the network. And I'm not suggesting I only talk to entrepreneurs about my problems, but it's challenging when you share your shit with someone who maybe has a more structured or more corporate situation, like they don't have those struggles. They don't have those stresses because they're protected from them. It's a structured system, and you end up sounding like a complaining asshole. All they can understand is you don't have a boss. So what's the fucking problem?
You make your own schedule. What's the problem?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's go. Let's go back to the part where you mentioned that you left like your undergrad education with an English degree,
Yes,
and journalism degree, and one of the things probably similar about a lot of our guests, especially now, like 20 years later, this is this weird time, like where the economy is going to have this thing or that type of thing. You mentioned law school. So help us understand how you selected a career in food from that pivot, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure that, or at least it sounds like there was a choice between like what I'm going to do next. It's, a point where you want to invest in yourself further. How did that go down from that perspective? Do you recall?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't an overnight decision.
Okay.
And it will sound cliche, but it was having a lot of conversations and a lot of people saying, well, if you're going to make this change and you're going to invest the money in doing it too, wouldn't you want to do something that you're passionate about? And as much as, I'd like to pretend that I could be extraordinarily passionate about patent law or working inside the criminal justice system, I wasn't. And I was working at law firms at the time too. I was working in special projects and marketing departments at law firms. And I got a pretty good look at what that life was like too. And I sort of stepped back and, granted, culinary is probably 1/6 the cost of law school. So that didn't hurt either. Mm-hmm. But if I'm going to take 2 years to do this, wouldn't I rather take this amount of money? Let's go to culinary school, at least learn the foundation, but then also travel, work in other cities, try to work for restaurants I want to work in, and invest in myself that way. And it was in just approaching it that way as an adult too, like not as, there's a difference, I think, in coming to it as probably 27 or 28 at that point in my life, as opposed to 18, right? I could say I am doing this from a business perspective, that here is what I'm trying to build towards, instead of someone like, oh, I don't know exactly what I want to do, but I like food and maybe I'm going to do this, and nothing wrong with that. A lot of good chefs come out that way, but also a lot of people that just, sort of get in and burn out quickly and maybe party a little too hard. But coming into it a little bit older, and then coming into it from a place of passion. So my background is I'm half Chinese. And the Chinese side of my family is the food side. So my early memories are cooking with my mom at a very early age, and cooking dinner with her or baking with her. And then when the whole family would get together, a lot of whom is in New York, and we would do Chinese New Year or bigger events, it's always based around food. Like it doesn't matter if you're going out. If you're going out, you're going to a large banquet type hall and you're doing 15 courses, all family style. And if you can leave under your own power, you failed. You haven't eaten enough. If you're cooking at home, it's a 3-day affair to make some dishes. And so it was a love coming from that too. And also like feeling a connection to it that I didn't really have in anything else I was doing. And then wanting to be able to take that and start to translate that into restaurants, and then translate into something that I can do as a product and still put that level of care into.
Did you do restaurants in your like young adult career?
Not until culinary. Not really. I think like a lot of people, I read No Reservations by Anthony Bourdain, and chef culture was very different in the late 2000s than it was in the 90s. Even it wasn't a glamorous thing. And I'm coming in a little late, but I had a lot of energy I wanted to put into something, and I was not adjusting to a 9-to-5, and I needed to be around people that had that same kind of energy and creativity and passion. And I would get angry when I wasn't working with people that showed that too. When there's someone on the line who just like maybe a little too hungover, doesn't care about how they're plating. Like, it was one of those, I'm like, what are you doing? Like, this is not why I'm here. And if you're not doing your job, it's going to reflect poorly on me on the other side of the line. So it was coming to it from that standpoint, but as an adult too. Like, I wasn't there just to party. There was plenty of partying. Like, it was, good times were had by all, but it was still something that I'm like, I am here for a specific reason too.
Sure. Yep. First and foremost, you can't let it bring your work down, right? Party all you want. No one says you got to sleep, but
yeah, you don't have to sleep. No, it's a kitchen. You don't need to sleep. There's
you
a
dare,
point.
Don't you dare send out a sloppy plate.
A while back when Mike and I dreamt up the idea and the premise of Convention Not podcast, I never imagined that it would really even last this long. And so I wanted to come and break into the episode just for a second to thank all the people who helped us make this show happen. We've got some help from a production level. We've got some help from a sponsorship level. We've got some help from a community and a listener level. All those people are important. For us, it's been a journey, and it's really taught us to both listen more and try to speak more clearly. So hopefully we're doing that to you today in this episode. And I'm hoping that you might take a chance and share this episode with somebody who you know. Let them hear for themselves. That's how we get more listeners, and that's helped us build this community. And we know you're a part of it. So thanks. Back to the show.
I can imagine the difficulty of, I'm not going to pretend that I know your personality that much just by that one anecdote, but like, you seem like someone who has a very clear vision in mind. And in the restaurants, you get a real mixture of attitudes and behaviors and work ethics. So I can imagine that maddening you. I could just see, like, guess what's real good in a restaurant is someone who doesn't give a shit. You can last for a long time. You'll have a lot of different jobs, but you can really survive in that industry if you can just go with the flow. But yeah, what you're saying, I can see that coming to a head, like kind of forcing like a decision to be made. And sorry to go further back, but I'm a little curious about 17-year-old Will. And like, why was your initial intention to even go into the field of journalism?
17-year-old Will did not have the most direction in the world.
Cool.
I've known Ryan a little bit since we were younger because we both went to Michigan State, and we probably met each other at a lot of parties and through a lot of mutual
you
friends.
And I probably met at State. You know that, right?
We were all sort of did with Marvin and that whole group. But it was, even when I was there, I think my first major was like biology, and then class 101 at 8:30 in the morning. I was like, no, this is...
Nah, you couldn't. Biology always had 8 a.m.s.
Oh, it was anything with an 8 a.m. automatically disqualified itself. I was like, psych's not going to work here either. So I don't want to say I was a casual student in college, but I was, I was a little casual. Like, I probably would have been better benefited from like taking a little more time to decide on something. But it was also like, I didn't know what it was going to be then. I was like, well, I love literature and I love kind of philosophy and journalism. So let me invest in those things without ever, anytime someone asks, well, what are you going to do with that? You're like, I'll figure it out. There's a whole publishing industry. It's like, it doesn't really exist now. And we're old enough that like a lot of digital publishing didn't exist at the time either. So it was just a very different world than it is now. But I think I had a little bit too much of that late 90s, like, I'm just going to do what I really enjoy and I'll figure it out.
It'll work out. Yeah. No, didn't we all?
Yeah.
Did you come from like an academic family, or at least somebody who was driving you individually into, I mean,
you got to get a degree.
Family from America wants you to get good grades to do those things, right? But was that like a big push? And there was a big push for like post-secondary education too?
Yeah. In my family, like, grades were always important. They were always pushed, and it was always, it's just an expectation. You're going to go to college one day. And I think it's still coming out of that idea that like, all you have to do is go to college and you'll get a job after.
It'll work out.
It'll work out for you.
That's the late 90s thing for sure. And I'm part of generation also. I mean, I guess we were all in college in the same regard. Is that as long as you made it through, you would make it around.
Yeah.
You know?
Student loans? Yeah, that's just part of it. Whatever. Yeah, give them to me. I'll pay those off right away.
Mine
just got to get a
done in like
degree.
18 months.
Oh, congrats.
Yeah.
Congrats, Will. Congrats.
Yeah,
Hey,
not that I'm counting it down.
to all you 20-year-olds out here, we're a bunch of 40-year-olds. And
We still have them.
It's an interesting decision. It is.
Yeah.
It is really from that perspective, right? Because I think it's easy to slough off the value. And we poke a lot of fun of value through the episodes of the show. But the reality is, well, part of why we talk, and the three of us are successful, at least from the standards of probably what most people would say. The reason that we talk is because of that like college education, right? Like that's the reason that we made those things. It'd be cool if you could like do that without taking out a mortgage for a home.
It would be nice.
Right.
I don't even know what the rates are now, but yes, it would be nice. Well, so let me ask you this. Because college, like a lot of education, is geared around like a social aspect right now. So do you guys, I mean, would you say you necessarily regret those decisions then?
No, not for me. I would say even in hindsight, and I got like pretty good grades in school. I would say in hindsight, and Mike, you have a technical education, so I guess you're an engineer from that perspective.
don't put all those labels on me, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll let you answer your own question. I try to do that. Well, I try to shift it. But for me, you know what it did was it introduced me. I grew up in a very homogenous community, and it just happened to be a very closed-minded community at that point in time. And so I was always curious about things outside of there, and I was always stubborn about being able to be curious, to kind of tie that back to a little bit earlier. So for me, I think that I could have gone to college and stayed in the apartments and worked in a restaurant and probably been able to do the same thing. I will say that I feel proud about getting a degree. And I feel that that's like an important part of it, but I wish there was something in between. That's what I would say.
I agree. And I don't know what that answer is either.
I don't. Right.
As we say all this, I'm, part of me is also at a point where I'm like, am I really looking at an executive MBA at this point in my life? Like, what should be the next step? So it's something where I'm always, I have 1 foot in and 1 foot out of, what should have been the case. But when I got married, half a dozen people there were people I've known, since college.
Correct.
And even through that group of people, like I've made a lot more friends there too. So I joke about it a lot, but like I wouldn't have traded it for anything. I may have changed my degree, but it was incredible.
If not college, something that would help or have helped me to pivot to actual adulthood. And so I don't think it's easy for me to imagine anything other than service. And I'm not a fan of like army service, right? Yeah. So like maybe there was something in between. I think it would be interesting. Mike, I don't know what your answer to that question might have been. But it's hard to imagine what that could be, you know?
No, honestly, I was going to echo pretty much what you said. Like, there might have been a couple slightly different decisions, but the experience and the overall 6 years of my life, that I wouldn't have gone about it any different way. But Ryan, you're right. It was that immersion into something that was so much different from what I was in when I was 17, that bridged the gap between 17 and 24. It wasn't all good. There was plenty of exposure to less than good things, and but without that, I'm just trying to think of how else could I have been around so many people that weren't from my hometown, that didn't think the same way as me, look the same way as me, talk the same way as me. So of course, from a technical standpoint, I've always thought of college as like, you just get this piece of paper that tells your future employer, like, you'll do all the shit that you're supposed to do. Like, we don't leave college being that useful to the world.
No, not at all.
You don't know how to fire that gun. You just got a bunch of bullets in your pocket, and people want bullets. So
the worst part is we think we know what to do with the gun when you graduate college.
Very
we're
much
sure
so.
about it. And like, really, no, we're just going to blow a toe off. So
turns out the more you learn, the less you know.
Just going to shoot.
You're just too young to know that.
I was going to say, shoot ourselves in the thigh. Plax was there when we were there.
That's our time frame.
Yeah. Don't bring a gun into the club, Plax.
Right.
So launching forward, not that many years. What was the end? Like, sorry, but you're describing you in the kitchen. And I'm trying to imagine kind of your last day. I'm not trying to be dramatic about it or anything like that, but like, did you have a coming to moment where you were just like, I like this world, but I can't play like this anymore. Like I can't be in it in this way anymore.
You mean in restaurants?
Yeah.
So it was, there was a point, and I was done with school, and I had done some internships out east, and I was back here cooking in Detroit. And the Detroit culinary scene 12, 13 years ago is not what it was now. Now there are James Beard nominees.
Sure.
There's incredible restaurants, incredible chefs here. Some of those chefs were here, but the restaurants weren't necessarily here at the time. So there was a lot of really talented people who maybe left to go to Chicago or one of the coasts. And I sort of cooked in that era. And I was with a really great group of cooks and chefs at the last restaurant I worked at. And it was this restaurant that's been like a Detroit staple for a long time. It's burned through. Anyone who's ever worked there has just horror stories about the place.
Okay.
But
public
everyone,
loves it. Everyone loves it.
The public loves it. It has this great facade and great front.
Gotcha.
But I was working there, and everyone just sort of thought like, oh, we'll be the ones to turn it around. It doesn't matter what the last 40 years told us. And so I was working there and just pretty, I was happy to be in the position I was and to be able to have a lot of menu control and do some cool things. But at the same time, I was like, this, I'm not going to stay here. Where else am I going to go? And I had already started Corridor Sausage in the butcher shop.
Okay.
Or maybe we weren't even butcher shop. No, we were begging and borrowing for space. So like some of the first events we did, I remember Memorial Day in like 2008, I think, coming into my off day and using the grinder there to make pâtés and make sausage and like running up and down the stairs with my partner to make these things. And so, we did utilize that pretty heavily. But it just wasn't going to be where I wanted to stay. And ultimately, things came to a head there. There was a point like where I was doing catering under my own banner and doing things on the side. And one day the general manager called me in his office and he said, you know what? We don't think you're dedicated enough to us. You're fired. And I said, well, that's interesting because I had an insurance claim against you last week when I sliced my hand open and got 7 stitches while I was butchering a case of kabocha squash for ravioli for Valentine's Day. And you let me work 3 services for Valentine's Day. So it's interesting you're telling me this now, but you know what? Cool.
Yeah.
I'm happy to move on.
That was what you needed.
It's what I needed, and I still worked after that. I had clients I worked for privately. And at that point I was like, well, I'm going to take this time and I'm going to sell sausage at every farmer's market I can find and to anyone I know that wants to buy some and to restaurants, and just said, this is a gift. I'll be able to do this. Like, let's go.
Mm-hmm. I'm getting the chills because now I'm excited.
It's a huge chip on my shoulder too. So it's like
I'm not going to go back there. I want to step forward now. So like Will walks out that night. Sorry, bro, but like sounds like you had a real ass job at that point. Like you're probably making pretty solid money, even though you knew it was probably going to be the last stop. And then you get fired. So like, oh shit. I got a bunch of grown-up stuff to deal with. We're not talking about 24-year-old Will here. We're talking about, somebody who'd been in the industry for a minute and wasn't in a rush. Like, this is the part that I really am intrigued by because you could have, sorry, you can hear how excited I am. You probably could have gone the next day, taken some interviews. I'm sure you had options. You could have stepped back into someone else's office and, done that somewhere else, right? But you were like, I mean, can you talk a little, and sorry to be so kind of intense about it, but like, did you just go to bed that night saying never again? Like, I'm done.
A little bit. Like it was something where I was just like, I'm good here. There was no place where I'm like, I'd be super excited to go work at like Tocoi or Selden Standard the next day.
Yeah.
Like they didn't exist. They were 5 years down the road.
The job you wouldn't have been there.
There was nothing there. And even before that job, the previous restaurant I was at locally was a place that was this uber ambitious Detroit project. It was funded for about $8 million, and it closed within a year. And like it had an incredible staff, but it was, I like to tell people you learn more about the companies you work for that fail than the ones that are successful because you see it all in play. And if you're looking at it with open eyes, you're like, Jesus Christ, what are you guys doing? And like, just as an interesting social experiment, like I was at this restaurant for 8 months, and to the point I was like, I just can't do it anymore because checks aren't clearing. Mm-hmm. But I would say those two things compounded, like to say, okay, I'm pretty done here. And it was also, ironically, I would say a couple years into Corridor, maybe, about 3 or 4. So once we had the factory open, that's when people started knocking on our doors too. And not just for wholesale, but to say like, do you want to do a restaurant? What do you want to do next? Like, where's, and sometimes a lot of times it was people that were like covertly like, well, I have a real estate project. What do you think of this? I'd be willing to put up 100,000. It's like, a restaurant costs like, at least 10 times more than that. Yeah. Like, what do you mean you're going to put, so you'd go down the road a few times and you'd realize people want to leverage, but there were some good offers in there. There were people that we like would have been interested in doing business with, and it was wrong time, wrong place. We actually owned a food truck for about a year. We brought in an outside partner that was sort of similar, a cold call, someone I didn't know. He flew us out to LA to eat at a restaurant he was partners in with his brother. And then he lived in Ann Arbor and we worked here. And he's a great guy. Like it was a fun year working on the food truck with him. It was just something in the Midwest as a business model wasn't something we wanted to keep pursuing. So we sold it, and food trucks are great for catering, but if you're trying to do day-to-day in office park, it's not totally viable. Mm-hmm. But I did find like even a few years in the company, like I knew I wasn't going to try to go back into restaurants. Like it wasn't where I was at in my life. I wasn't going to work until 2 a.m. Like in a restaurant, when I was working out East on an internship at a Michelin restaurant, it was something where you reach an equilibrium of how tired you are. Like I would basically, if I left work at 1 or 2 in the morning, or maybe had a beer, a couple, maybe more than a couple, I'd get on the subway, I'd go back out to Queens. And if I fell asleep on the train, I knew I would have missed my stop because I listened to the same National album every night. And if I had reached a certain point on that album, I knew I had to get off because I was one stop past the Jamaica exit.
Boxer or?
This was Boxer and Alligator.
I was going to say Alligator, pre-Boxer? Damn.
No, it was both of those. There was actually an NPR concert too I had that was basically just those two. So it was one of those 3.
Too, Will.
Yeah, still my favorite band, man.
This is pre-streaming time. If this is
pre-streaming. This was all on like my iPod Touch.
Yeah, like your separate device at that point.
Yeah.
So, man,
I know we're bouncing around, but it's it's such an awesome story. I can't help
because I guess I wonder, and I'm always so cautious to put anybody in a box, especially somebody who's gracious enough to come on the show. But I wonder, like, when I hear you and I think about so many chefs who I know who traditionally have some sort of restaurant love, right? Like maybe it was a different story that worked differently in their family, or it was a love or a mentor that they had as a kid or something like this. But it does make a lot of sense in knowing you and understanding about the way that you present yourself, that the silliness of that. And I don't want to be like disrespectful to proprietors of restaurants, because I know that's something that actually all 3 of us are really into, especially the differences in the components of all of it, right? But to you as a career, you wanted to like limit risk from that area and to go into like a different part of the world, right?
Correct.
Right.
Correct. Yeah. The silliness is great. Like if you are too self-serious about it, it's a recipe for a nervous breakdown within 2 or 3 years. And I'm not going to say I wasn't on that path at various points. Like I definitely was, but like you have to know how to like turn it off at a certain point.
It's a young person's game.
It's a young person's game.
Maturity, can keep you in it if you survive long enough to develop it, right? Like real easy to burn out real young.
Yeah, and I get the itch every now and then. Like I do get the itch of like I start working on a concept, or I always kind of think like my dream concept would sort of be like a cross between a dumpling house and then like the Chinese bakeries I grew up with. Or now that, we have Madison Heights is more developed, the great places along there, you can go in and get some fresh bao and some really cool pastry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll take you. I know you just moved back here, but We have a
I'm
eating
missing.
excursion too.
Yeah,
So
okay.
we'll go do that. But it's, and then there's a community of us that sort of bond around whether we're, mix or whatever, who we sort of bond through our food too. So I always look at them like, yeah, I feel it. I feel the call sometimes. And then like I'll do a catering or a pop-up and be like, it's a young man's game, man.
Yeah.
My knees hurt. Like, this is awful.
5
My
days
back is
afterward,
killing me.
right, yeah.
Oh, it's brutal. It's brutal. I'm not going to squat 150 times a night to go get the cilantro from the low boy. Like, that hurts, man.
I'm over it. Well, I couldn't have asked for a better kind of segue. And if, we don't have to get too into it, but I literally do kind of want to get into, I have always been just fascinated with food, as much with making it as consuming it. And I get that from my parents, my dad especially was very creative as a chef. And he was a good chef too, but he'd experiment with a lot of stuff too. And it's been 20 plus years that my dad was just making sausage on the countertop, so there's been a lot of things in my family that I knew they're normal in my family, but I know they're not that normal. What I'm getting at is I've seen it made, like I can appreciate I don't want to say complexities of it. I'm not trying to belittle it, but it's not easy. And I'm kind of curious, like, why sausage, dude? And like, if you wouldn't mind kind of getting into the early days of like you and Zach, like, what were you just grinding meat up because you had some cheap meat and you wanted to make something out of it? Like, I'm really, really curious.
Yeah, where does it go to that idea?
I mean, the first part of sausage is delicious, man. Like,
yeah, especially the type of sausage that y'all create, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Charcuterie and sausage, right? Like, I think it's just both, right?
Yeah, and it's something. When we really started, we kind of looked around and is like, where do you get good sausage? Like, growing up in Metro Detroit, in the 80s, there was still a lot of Polish butchers in Hamtramck. There was a lot of German butchers in East Point, and there was a lot of Italian butchers in Warren and that area. They're all gone. So I did grow up with this like area that had like really great European sausage and butchery. It's all gone. The families have moved on. The demographics have changed, and I miss it. Like, I miss going into the shop where I knew the dude behind the counter, and I was 6 years old, and they'd just give me a hot dog to walk around and eat. Like, those were the type of places we grew up with. Yep. And it was something that when my partner and I met, we were both at that restaurant at the same time, and we started doing lunch specials of sausage together, and something we both like doing. We do terrines and pâtés together and sausage. And at the same time, I was writing for the Ann Arbor News. And it was like this dream job. I finally had gotten like a regular column with a newspaper. Nice. I was covering entrepreneurism. I was covering food entrepreneurs. And it was my goal. It was my job to seek out interesting entrepreneurs, write about them. So I wrote about like Avalon Bakery back in the day and other people around Detroit. And well, I had this job for about 2 or 3 months. And then I think it was like July 6th or something, the headline came out in the newspaper that the Ann Arbor News is set to close. So I took that as another sign from the universe that this other thing that was something I loved doing, was passionate about, was probably not a viable career. And at that point, I think I was on my way to Paris with some friends from culinary school, writing an article about beekeepers in Ann Arbor, and just said, you know what? I think it's time to focus on sausage here. I think this writing thing is probably not for
That's
me.
cool. So it was that's like a some sort of monumental realization, right? Like you really kind of linked it together.
Yeah.
But in the effort of continuing these focuses on moving yourself forward, right?
Yeah.
Moving it forward from a career of creativity behind the knife.
Yeah.
On the other side of the pen. That's really cool. I never knew that about you that way. That's really interesting.
Well, one of the beautiful things about food is all of us kind of feel this way. All of us are really passionate, and we view it as a community. And Detroit is nothing if not a big, small town, especially back then when like I had met the women that owned Avalon and interviewed them for half an hour one day. And suddenly, like, if I had any questions, I could call them. Phil from Slows, same thing. Like, he's busy running a barbecue empire. But if I had a question about building out a space, I could call him and he would get back to me. And that's where we were at as a community. It was just anything I needed to know, like we could figure someone out that could answer a question. And I love that. I loved that period of time where like not all of us were licensed. Like I wasn't licensed for the first year. I had to figure it out eventually. But like there was so many people that would just get together and we would talk about like, here's what I'm doing and here's what I'm working on. Maybe it was a restaurant, maybe it was sausage, but there was an incredible incubator at the time of community and people that just wanted to hang out together. Like we used to have the chef's card game on Sunday nights. And I look at like the table of people that were there now and everyone's owns one or two restaurants. Everyone has James Beard Awards. And I'm like, Jesus, like how, like, can we just go back to like playing cards on Sunday and shit talking each other? And I missed that so much, but it was the love for that community that in a way like drove me to want to keep doing what I was doing because it was part of this and it was being able to work collaboratively with people. And I think if anything that's carried me through this, it was the love of the product, but then also finding a group that you can work collaboratively with and just share and build together.
Hey, Convention Out listener. We're taking a break from the show. And I'm coming at you to thank you for, first of all, listening to us and taking part in this community that we built over the past couple of years. But I'm also asking you, just like we always do in breaks like this, to take a second and review us on your podcast channel. It helps all kinds of things. Makes us a more popular show across the network. It also helps us understand what you might like to hear as a listener. So, however you do it, give us some stars, give us the thumbs up. You know the podcast that you're listening to. It's Convention Not. Thanks for tuning in. Back to the show.
It's really special, and usually, I'll be honest, man, I don't know how many of us put ourselves in these places, but it's easy to recognize in hindsight when you were in a very competitive but collaborative environment and how productive and just like, I'm not in that space anymore. You know what I mean? But I used to work at a company and I had that around me, you know, and like that's, it's hard to recreate that. You know, and I appreciate you kind of like longing for that. I definitely, I get that experience, but you know, there's a time and a place, right? Like there's a point in your life. I read up a little bit on Zach's background and I understood like the honing in on like the charcuterie and things like that. And you mentioned growing up, that interest and the fondness of the butchers and the sausage accent in your household though, and you mentioned your mom is Chinese or
Yes.
Okay. Had you ever seen sausage made before you were like in school making it yourself? I mean, other than at the butcher shop.
No,
That's a good question.
no,
Okay, yeah.
no. I hadn't. You know, it was one of those weird things of like, I really hadn't. I was like, but I could like watch, be like, I think I'd be good at that. Like you start looking at it, like, I think I'd be okay there.
Well, and you do have that foundation because I recall that time in Detroit, around Metro Detroit too, and we're from different parts of the city. So, like for our listeners, I think it's like Will would be more north, Mike would be more west, and I would be more south. But there still was a world of intermingled ethnic butcher shops.
Yes.
Right. It was not like, you know, a grocery store is a grocery store is a grocery store today, but the brands that exist in the grocery store almost were as numerous as the butcher shops that existed.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and that had to have been able to flavor some of what you were doing, even if you weren't making it at home. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you go to a friend's house and it's pierogies and kielbasa, or, you know, man, I'm just thinking about like fresh created Italian sausage.
My mouth is watering thinking about that.
Yeah. And now that stuff is behind a glass counter in a different way. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And everything in the sausage world when we started become commodity. It was this world of like, where you're gonna try to be $2.59 a pound and in 1 million stores across the country. And those were the brands that were ubiquitous across all stores.
Sure.
So we came in and we said, no one is approaching this from an artisan value. Like no one is coming in and saying like, we want to use pasture raised pigs. We want to use antibiotic free meats. And so we just came and said, like, here's how we want to eat. Here's how we want to feed our family. We want fresh ingredients and not things that have sat in a bag for months and have no flavor and just impart a cardboardy sausage. And it was interesting. Even like the field has changed a lot. Like there are more artisan brands out there now. We found ourselves like being the small guy punching up that were pretty unique to companies coming out of Chicago that had big VC funding, that were basically marketing firms coming out of another factory. And it was interesting how quickly in just a very short period of time things pivoted. But, you know, we try to stay scrappy and nimble and just do the best product we could.
You mentioned expansion in other regions. Dude, I moved from East Lansing to Toronto in like the mid 2000s. And it was just like, holy shit, my mind exploded. Like I don't know if you've spent much, I'm sure you've been to Toronto before, right? Like, you know, Kensington Market, the like kind of, it's more of, it's like a vintage heaven / Eastern European marketplace, not to mention St. Lawrence Market, like all these things in my mind just exploded.
Yeah, the market culture is so much different in Toronto than it is in a lot of the American cities, for sure.
Toronto
very
is
much so.
It's its own world. It's incredible.
So great. We talked about that in the last episode.
Did you?
Just mind blowing. And then, like an idiot, I get all that culture and just get addicted to it. And then I moved to Hawaii, which has an abundance of culture. It's just very specific.
I'm sorry if you have a hard time adjusting to the culture that is tropical paradise.
Right.
That must be really rough for you.
Not a lot of sympathy.
Trust me.
I don't have what color is it here right now? It's gray.
Right.
What shade of gray is it today?
What I'm getting at, Will.
You can't get surfing every morning. By the way, so.
When do I get corridor sausage in Hawaii? That's what I'm asking you, bro.
That's what you were leading up to. I get.
Yeah.
I
You know what? Our new company does have product in Hawaii, so I will have to start leaning on my brand manager a little bit more to say, like, hey, why aren't we out there yet? So we're working on it.
At least for an exploratory trip. It seems like the R&D is simple.
You should probably get out here and experience it.
Sure.
So you can
think so.
I feel like that would be probably an interesting venture, but you could get pretty curious with your pork flavors with Hawaiian sausages for sure. That would be cool. So
Kahlua sauce.
I want to. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead, Ryan, please.
I want to just like pivot a little bit here because I know that you are married to a journalist.
Yes.
And one of the things that I was prepared today to sit down and start to talk about food and to understand and, you know, kind of talk about some of these things. And the three of us, I know, are connoisseurs of flavor, right? Whatever the things we might think. But one of the things that I always find so cool about our guests, and truly my favorite guest, and I don't say this just because you're actually sitting across from me, which is kind of rare.
It's an interesting dynamic.
Is that often the spouse that comes with has an equal power. And I know that that's something with Ashley. So I wanted to give you like a minute. And of course, we're kind of giving Ashley a shout out because we know we might want to get her to come on the show a little bit. But I'm not really priming it that way. The way that I wanted to talk about is I wanted you to talk a little bit about how having somebody who is well matched to you has helped you transition throughout the merger. Because we talked about a lot of happy stuff, and it's always so easy to remember like Silicon Valley about how a merger works, even though you're not in the tech space, right? But one of the things that I know that is like true about you is your family. And if you could like share with us like a little bit about how that works, because that's it for you. And I've always known that about you, by the way, since we were younger in that way, you know?
So first off, two entrepreneurs under one roof in a pandemic, it's not 100% recommended.
Right.
So this year it's been, I think, it's been incredible as a way where I'm not joking when I say, like, if I weren't working on this deal, like I might not be here right now from the position I'm sitting in. And to be able to sit back and watch what Ashley's done with her company, Detour Detroit, that is a locally focused newsletter, and see the awards that she has won for her coverage of COVID-19, to see the growth that she's had, to see the ways they've engaged the community and try to answer community questions, and to train journalists in the community and grow out, even in just the last year, not even talking the two before that, but just the way that they have really try to say, we can do this, we can solve a problem that people have right now. Like, it inspires me, like it really does. But still, at the human element, it's something like, there's been a lot of hard nights. There's been nights where we both looked at each other and it's like, I don't know what we're going to do tomorrow. Like, we have a newborn. We had our son was born on January 2nd. We are locked in a Thunderdome with this little dude. Like, he just, for those first few months when we didn't know he had a dairy allergy and is just waking up constantly in pain and we can't help him.
Man,
like, and then you can't go anywhere. And so I have another daughter who's 6. I am divorced once, and Ashley is the greatest mom to Amelia, my oldest daughter in the world. Like, they are best friends. They love each other. And I'm saying all this as a way to say, in a normal world, when you have a kid, you can do things like say, I'm going to go to Target for 2 hours. I'm going to go to Home Depot for 2 hours. In pandemic world, you don't get to do that. You're stuck in Thunderdome. No, it's just you and that little person, and you can't get out of the house. So it's been a lot this year, but there's never been a point where like one of us is just like, I don't know what we're going to do, where the other hasn't lifted them up. And that has just been, I think, a testament to her too, of just being the eternal optimist, but also just emotionally open and available. And that I've gone through a lot of therapy in the last 10 years. And it's something that I still like have tried to be mindful of, but like it keeps me present with that too.
Sure. What a cool response. Yeah.
Beautiful. No, that I honestly, the second you brought it up, I wasn't, when I asked you about that night, you know, that last night when your boss caught you moonlighting, were you with Ashley at that time?
No, I was, that was long before I'd ever met Ashley, actually.
Okay. Were you single? Were you in between relationships at that time?
I was with my first wife at the time.
Okay.
And it was something, you know, we worked through that, and she got me through those hardest first years. Like, she did. It's something that again, of like, I think for anyone to be successful, there needs to be, you can't do it alone. Like, you're not an island. You need someone who carries you through financially, emotionally, all of those things. And even in that relationship was a case of just the wrong people in the wrong circumstances, who just had too many bad things happen in too small of a time.
Sure.
And went through a lot. It wasn't a long-term sustainable thing. We co-parent together. We get along really well around our daughter, and it just fill out, you know, want to make sure that our daughter has the best life she possibly can. And it wasn't always easy. It was figuring a lot of things out when you're coming from a lot of emotional pain.
Yeah.
But I'm happy, like, with the point we're both at of like, we're doing this, like, we're co-parenting, and, you know, now there's Ashley involved, and she's our daughter's favorite thing in the world. Like, there's nothing that makes Amelia happier than trying to like tackle her out of nowhere.
What a beautiful team. You know, like I always say, it takes a village, and every person we talk to on this show is in a place of success and at least momentary happiness. I know it's hard to sustain, and no one's alone. No one's here bragging about, man, I shed these people and I did this on my, you know, there may have been some decisions you made on your own, but the reason why you're still here today, and I think willing to share your story, no pun intended there, is those people you've surrounded yourself with, man. Damn, Will, that's a pretty amazing, like I could get way more into like the nitty gritty on. All right, I got one more question. You tell me what the sausage mixture that you're most excited about right now is. Like you mentioned some unique flavors there, and I just we'll encourage our audience to check out the website and go find them flavors. But tell me about something weird you're working on right now.
That's kind of fun. Like I'm working on some fun things right now. Like we're sitting here drinking some pretty good bourbon from Ryan. I'm actually working on a few different bourbon sausages right now.
Yes.
I'm working on some other more charcuterie based things that again I'm really excited to finally jump into, and then some more marinated products. But like it still goes back to, I'm like, all right, what can I do in sausage? So there's a few things in the pipeline between bourbon and Szechuan and some other things where I'm like, this is still fun for me to get my wrists in and like try to make some delicious product.
I have to imagine somebody who's like a true creator, that shifting the production from one level to the next level has to be like a whole new thing that you're learning about, and being able to experience with resources has to be like a really big thing too. You know?
It's exciting to experience with resource, because it's then getting back to what I love about this is working collaboratively too. And part of this experience has even been when we first started talking to this other company. They took us through this tour of their plant, and I had already figured out in my mind of like, my goal for 2020 is in one way or another to have found what my next steps in my life are.
Okay.
And it could have been moving on to another field and selling my shares to my partner, or outside companies, or just selling the label. And I'd really wanted to look at some of these options. And a mutual acquaintance put me in touch with the owner of this company, and I had met him at some social events, a few times over the years. But he brought us in, gave us a tour of the plant, and like, it's incredible. They were literally one block away from the factory I've been in the last 10 years. I knew the size of this company.
Okay.
I knew what they did, but I'd never been in their plant. And you go in, and it's like a Frankenstein of 3 different floors across 2 buildings, and it's pieced together. But every inch of this building is immaculately thought out, and thought out for safety, for quality, and all these things. And we were just blown away. We're like, oh my God, we just didn't know. And we're the small guys in this deal. Like, their revenue is well over 100 times what our revenue is. And sort of we're looking through, and we're back at the office, and I'm a little like awestruck at the end. And they kind of look at us. They're like, well, what do you guys think? And I sort of don't know what to say, but it's going back to this idea of working with people I like and collaboratively. My response was, look, you guys know what you can do for us. Like, that's not a question. We're the small guys who here we are with our company and our stresses, and we need help. But not to sound naive, but what can I do for you?
Yeah.
And that's when the conversation picked up. After being in the room for about 90 minutes, 2 hours, conversation suddenly gets a new life. And conversation becomes like, oh, what can Will do for us? And they're like, well, here's what we have. Here's what we're working on. I'm like, I'm not even going to mince words. I'm actually really interested in this. Let's talk through this. And we just start brainstorming. We start brainstorming these new departments they want to build and new product lines they want to build. And that's the thing that kept it going. It was just then a conversation of being open about professionally, like, what are you guys looking for? You can solve my problems, but how do I solve your problems? How do I solve the problems of a company 100 times bigger than my own? They still have problems. And it just grew from there. We did bi-weekly check-ins. Things were shut down. 80% of my business is not in grocery stores. It's in restaurants. Yeah. So, and theirs was the same way too. So we would check in. And I remember in like March saying, like, if there's nowhere for this to go for a year, just please tell me, because I don't want to spin my wheels. And they said things will go back to normal eventually. That's not a concern for us right now. And they kept it moving too. So I've really respected that about them this entire time. And even now, as I've been there since August, I see it in their culture. So it's still something that excites me right now. And it gives me so much opportunity too.
How refreshing. Like how refreshing to.
Yeah, it's a good.
Yeah,
good
that's
merger.
really what a merger is. That is a merger, right?
Yeah.
Like, we hear merger and we think all these cool financial things, but a merger is a merger of the mind. So, I think that's cool. I feel like, we for sure got to get you back on an expert episode. Mike, I could imagine putting Chris Warsaw and Will Branch together to talk. maybe about like food of the future or some little. So we do these expert episodes with which we pull our previous guests back together, and we pull them back to just kind of talk about some of the mainframe subjects of the show, which one of which is food and nutrition, of course, right? And so I think that might be cool. I'd be interested to be curious to come back at some point in time. So maybe we can work that out. I'm sorry we gotta like kind of close this up here because we're getting toward the end, and we haven't really dented this bottle. For our listeners, we're going through the Kentucky Owl Rye 11 year. This is a good. Will and I are working on starting a bourbon club together. Something
I'm really proud of you guys,
and I think it's a cool network, and I'm excited. So maybe I might not be invited to the bourbon club, but if I'm listening to this and I want to try to like follow you, or I want to follow the business Corridor Sausage, or however that works, where might I go? Is it
find us on Instagram, find us on Facebook. We've been a little slow to update things lately, but things are coming back really quick. Our partners are helping us with so much. So yeah, if you've been looking for us in stores, even had a hard time finding in the past, it's all changing. There's a lot of cool things happening. So yeah, follow us there.
Okay, so it's coming back. It's coming back. Corridor Sausage in the airport still open?
Should reopen in February. No one's traveling internationally, so Delta shut that wing down right now.
Yeah.
The Pistons and the Lions, same thing. So we hope to get back to some of those things at our other stand soon.
I remember how much I smiled the first time I got off. There was a flight that I had taken on a small jet from somewhere to here. Like I was living in Atlanta. I'm here, back full time now, but I was flying somewhere, and I had remembered hearing that you opened the store, and I walked and I actually just stopped and bought something because I was like, man, I gotta patronize. But it was such a sense of pride to see that in the airport. So
at the airport, yeah.
Yeah. So if you're still not listening and you're still not following us, we're at convention._podcast. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you review us. Make sure you do all those things that you should do for podcasts, because it's just us making shows like in basements of houses like we're doing here tonight. Mike's probably somewhere from the beach, or at least on his way to the beach today. Did you surf this morning, Mikey?
No, I got an earache.
You got an earache. So Mike's out of the water. That's tough. It was 18 for Will and I this morning when we let the dogs out.
But Mike has an earache, so he has it really hard.
You asked. I didn't.
It's tough. I feel so glad that I asked that.
Put your plugs and get in this afternoon. All right, that'll make me happier, Ryan.
On that note, we're gonna close it. Thanks for joining us, Will. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.